I'm Heather from Atlanta. My question for y'all is, when you're speaking to people, friends and family, who are so deceived by the information on Fox News and every Facebook conspiracy out there, how do you have a productive conversation when they discount your facts because they were gained from the mainstream media?
It's Wednesday, December 2nd, just 49 days from the inauguration. And just like Governor Ducey, we're all about to change our ringtones. Today on Vote for America, we'll be talking with the Lincoln Project's own Mike Madrid and former COVID patient David Lat. And now our host, Lincoln Project co-founder Jennifer Horn.
And welcome to Vote for America on LPTV. We are so glad that you are with us today. It's a beautiful day here. I hope it's beautiful where you are too. So many good things happening in the world. So much to look forward to. Let me just start by saying, you know who watches this show almost every time we do it? My dad. He doesn't always agree with me, but he loves watching what we're doing here at LPTV. So let's start by saying, hey, Dad, I hope you're having a great day today also. 49 days until Joseph R. Biden is sworn in and becomes the next president of the United States, which means that with your help and the help of so many others, so many millions of others across the country, we will have achieved at least one of our goals at the Lincoln Project, to have defeated Donald Trump at the ballot box. But the fight to defeat Trumpism continues, and we need you to stay with us and be part of that as we go forward. So there's been some interesting updates, some interesting news since the last time we were all together. Let's start with there's a recount, and I just, for whatever reason, I find this particularly delightful. The Trump campaign called for a recount of part of the vote in Wisconsin, and they had to raise $3 million to pay for that recount for themselves, which they did. And that recount has resulted in two particularly entertaining results. The first is, now that Donald Trump's efforts have paid for that recount, Joe Biden has 123 more votes in Wisconsin than when he started. It turns out that it wasn't Donald Trump that they missed a few votes for, it was Joe Biden. So thank you, Mr. President, for that one. And we've also since learned that apparently somebody who made a significantly generous donation to the recount effort for Donald Trump wants his money back. We heard in The Guardian that a Trump supporter who gave $2.5 million to fight election fraud, not just that one recount, obviously, wants his money back. I don't know where we are at this point, if the president has launched, a dozen challenges or 4 dozen challenges. They just keep coming in, and he has lost every single one of them. In fact, AG Barr, William Barr, who we know to be very much a Donald Trump apologist and protector in many ways, launched an investigation of his own from the FBI into voter fraud. And we just learned, I think it was yesterday, he came out and said they've done their investigation and there is no evidence, zero, nada, zilch, no evidence of widespread voter fraud anywhere in the country in this election. And while I find it very entertaining, I guess, that Donald Trump is now being forced to accept this information, this outcome from people who have been in the closest, tightest part of his circle, It's also really serious, and it's something that we should all understand. The Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement officer of the country, called for an investigation through the FBI of whatever information was brought, the Trump folks were bringing forward trying to suggest fraud. And they've said very clearly, the AG has said very clearly, there is no evidence whatsoever of fraud in this election. It's important for us to understand that, and for all of us to continue to be a voice for reason and integrity and character. This was a free and fair election, and on January 20th, it's going to it is going to give us the outcome that if we're going to have the outcome that we've all worked so hard for. So I think that I am ready to welcome our first. Good, it's good. We're all talking to each other in our ears today, trying to make sure that everybody's up to speed and ready to run. I'm really excited. We've enjoyed so much having him with us in the past. Here to guest host today is one of my co-founders at the Lincoln Project, our data master and an all-around good guy, Mike Madrid. Mike, thank you so much for making time for us today. It's great to have you.
Jennifer, it's always great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Mike, you know that one of our favorite things is when the audience sends us questions for you. So we're going to start at the top right now with what I thought was the most important question of all the ones that came in today. I thought this one was particularly important. So we'll bring this one up, and they want to know, Jennifer and Mike, what kind of alcohol do you imbibe in to help with the anxiety? I had a shot of tequila this morning already. So I thought, man, if they've got that kind of anxiety, first,
Yeah.
I have to
I'm a
say,
tequila.
I don't want to be, you're a tequila guy?
I'm a tequila guy myself, but I'm not a morning tequila guy, fortunately. So
Right.
usually I try to make sure that at least it's a little bit past noon before I try to calm my nerves that way. But I'm hoping everybody is starting to sense a little bit more calm that's taken over the country. That we still have a ways to go here, but the inner circle is shrinking. A lot of this stuff we have been talking about some time. You've been hearing Jennifer talk about this on this show. And I hope our guidance has been helpful in kind of making sure that everybody is a little bit more relaxed, going back from what the strategy was that we laid out to what was happening on election night to talking about the interregnum. It's been a heck of a run. It's obviously not over yet. There is a ways to go, but hopefully the alcohol consumption has reduced considerably. We're hoping out there, but if not, we'll do our best to kind of keep your blood pressure down in our own interregnum, if you will.
Right. So I hate to be boring, but I'm more of a hot tea kind of person when I'm anxious
Oh, good.
than a morning drinker. But I have been known on occasion to drop a shot of something or the other in my tea. So
Wow.
and to
Okay.
your not, I never say when. You never know. It's just the tea mug in my hand, and you don't know what's in it. So, but to your point, my anxiety has diminished significantly. And I think where people are really concerned, Mike, at this point is because, as I was saying before you joined us, there's been no voter fraud. Trump has lost it all. He's lost all of his cases, and now he's just losing his mind on social media. And it's going to continue to be painful and kind of up and down. But on January 20th, we're going to have a new president sworn in, and there's no question in my mind that that's what the outcome is going to be. But I think where people are still genuinely concerned, for good reason, of course, is looking at the two Senate races in Georgia, where we have
Yeah.
two Republican incumbents who are going to be defending their seats in a runoff in early January. So, Mike, let's start by taking a quick look at part of a Kelly Loeffler campaign commercial that I think kind of sets the tone for where we can start this conversation.
What we need more than ever is a business mind. We need someone who understands how to not only write paychecks and sign paychecks, but what it feels like waiting on that paycheck.
Kelly left.
So, Mike, Kelly Loeffler, who we both know is worth somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion, is trying to sell herself to the people in Georgia as the candidate who understands what it feels like waiting for that paycheck to come in at the end of the month.
To do and what the focus is here, because it is kind of interesting. As many of you know and recognize and have heard a lot about, Donald Trump did marginally increase his share of the African American vote. A lot of this was predicated on the idea, false, however, that he is a successful businessman, a successful business owner. This is speaking directly to that same messaging, to that same core audience, in an attempt to mitigate the African American share that Loeffler is likely to lose by, right? That's all we try to do is we focus on two things as political consultants and operatives. What's the turnout going to be? And then what's the break going to be? Meaning, what's the break, the percentage share that each candidate's going to get? This is all about recognizing that African American turnout will be key for the Democrats to win this special election. Difficult to do in January, but a lot of resources, a lot of energy. Stacey Abrams and others have devoted a full amount of time, energy, and resources to make this work. This ad is designed specifically to try to peel off that 1 or 2 or 3% that Donald Trump was able to do in an attempt to prevent the Loeffler from losing in a close election.
And is that where our focus is going to be, Mike, from the Lincoln Project? Is that are those the demographics that we're going to sort of be zeroing in on as well?
That's a really great question. There's 3 keys to Georgia here, so let's talk about those very briefly. The first, as we were just examining, is African American turnout. Stacey Abrams did a phenomenal job, along with others, in making sure that we had a very high African American turnout. In fact, a record number of raw votes came in from Black voters in Georgia. Unfortunately, what we also saw was the actual percentage share drop slightly of African Americans because, and this is the second demographic, rural white voters, very strong Trump voters. We call them the deep MAGA counties here at the Lincoln Project headquarters. That turnout is going to be real interesting to see if it continues to show up without Donald Trump on the ballot. We will be focusing strenuously on that area, and I'll talk about some of those strategic considerations in just a second. But the third, and this is really the critical element, this is the real Lincoln Project voters where we were successful in most of the battleground states, and we're going to try to replicate that success in Georgia. These are college-educated white suburban voters, women which you helped us lead the effort on, Jennifer, very, very successfully moving those voters in 2016, 2018, and even more in 2020. We're also going to double down on men, college-educated men, which moved even more than we had thought that they would. This is why we at the Lincoln Project made a late decision to come in. We pulled our resources out of North Carolina, recognizing that we weren't going to quite get there, moved that money into Georgia because we saw those numbers moving, pushed hard in the Georgia suburbs surrounding Atlanta, and were able to move about 9% of Republican voters into the Biden column and get a win there. We're going to try and replicate that 3-pronged success on January 5th.
And I want to emphasize what you just said, Mike, because it was kind of one of the core ambitions for us at the Lincoln Project, moving those that 9% that you just talked about. Talk about that a little bit more for me, because 9% is even higher than we saw in some other areas.
It was much higher than we saw in other areas. And in fact, if it were not for the extraordinarily high rural white vote that came out, non-college educated white voter, we would have seen a much wider margin in Georgia. We always referred to the number as the Bannon line at the Lincoln Project. 4% was always our goal. We needed to get 4% of Republicans to cross over, not vote for Donald Trump, and vote for Joe Biden. That same metric essentially holds here. If we can get just 4 to 5% of Republicans to peel away from Loeffler and Perdue, vote for Warnock and Ossoff, we think that they stand a good chance if we get and match the same kind of African-American turnout that we saw on Tuesday night earlier this month. But that is really where the Lincoln Project's bread and butter is at, is how do we move specifically college-educated voters who have had enough of kind of what the Trump and Trump party means to move into a new way of governing. Just 3 to 4% of these voters could really tip the entire balance of power for the country, and they reside in the Georgia suburbs, and they're going to be hearing quite aggressively from the Lincoln Project from now until January 5.
So another story on Kelly Loeffler that was out earlier this year, Mike, I think is interesting as we're talking about these particular demographics, because you're talking about a number of different groups, some of whom might also be lower income, some are more middle class income. Mm-hmm. And there was a story that came out on Senator Loeffler earlier this year about her after being informed of what was happening with the coronavirus, after being in on a Senate update on that she kind of went out there and embraced this Trump message of downplaying the coronavirus at the same time that she made some changes in her stocks and in her investments, and started investing in PPEs and some other investment activities that she took that benefited her financially. And while nobody, certainly begrudges, people who, make a smart move in the stock market and you make the financial benefit from it. This is a sitting US senator who had information that was kept from the American people that ultimately led to a devastating health outcome, devastating loss of life. And she made some money on it. She made a couple bucks on it in the stock market. Is that going to be a message? Is that going to be something that you think will influence the vote in the runoff? Is that something people still care about?
First of all, Jennifer, let me just say I love how politic you are in suggesting that this was just investment activity. This was insider trading. This is trading and influence. Okay, this is essentially.
And Mike, you're calling it insider trading, but remember, the Republicans investigated this and found no ethical wrongdoing on the part of Kelly Loeffler. Let's remember that too.
That's fair enough. If this is not insider trading, I don't know what is. So look, yes,
I don't know what is.
This will be a very salient issue in this campaign. You're going to hear a lot about this because it's not just the Democrats talking about it. It's not just the Lincoln Project's talking about it. This was Fox News. Judge Jeanine Shapiro, Tucker Carlson have all taken her to task for insider trading. As they say, she's knee deep in the swamp when she had just gotten there. She received a briefing on the coronavirus, knew exactly how dangerous and how damaging it was going to be. Her first thought was not for Georgians. Her first thought was not to contain this. It was a matter of life and death. Her first thought was, how can I take this information and make some money on Wall Street, where my husband runs the New York Stock Exchange? So she stepped out in the hallway, made a phone call, and started buying stock in companies that would benefit from the pandemic. This type of messaging you will start to see in some of those very ruby red rural Georgia counties that I was just talking about, that second key demographic, because when you hear from Tucker Carlson, when you hear from Jeanine Shapiro on Fox News with the Chiron rolling beneath it, saying that she was knee deep in the swamp, it's going to have an impact because these are trusted messengers in conservative audiences where people are going to say, you know what, this is a bridge too far. This isn't about being a successful businesswoman as she's trying to portray herself in her previous ad. This is about crookedness. This is about gaming the system. This is the type of access that the average entrepreneur, the average scrapping, small business owner does not have access to. I wish I could step out of the hallway, make a phone call, and make a couple $1 million because of the seat that I was appointed to take over. I think it's going to have deep resonance. We'll just see whether, not just whether it moves the needle, we'll see how much it moves the needle on Kelly Loeffler.
Right. To what degree? To what degree? Yeah, it's despicable. And I think you had it exactly right when you said her first thought was not for Georgians. Her first thought was not for the American people who are going to suffer. Her first thought was, ooh, I see a couple more dollars that maybe we can pull into our bank account. So I appreciate you being so direct about it. So let's move on in Georgia, Mike. The other person on the ballot in a runoff in January is the other Republican incumbent senator down there, David Perdue. He is running against, do I have that right, David? Is that his first name?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And he's running against Jon Ossoff. And what I thought was really interesting there was, contrary to all political tradition and to the idea of being giving the people as much information as possible when we're approaching elections, Perdue has refused to debate Ossoff.
Or Warnock.
Who? I thought, no, it's Ossoff. He won't debate. Warnock is Loeffler. Loeffler is running against Warnock, and Perdue won't debate Ossoff. Isn't that right? I think I have that right.
I'm sorry. Did I screw it up?
Yeah. I'm not going to accuse you of any such thing, but Perdue doesn't want to debate Ossoff, and for me, because I ran for Congress and in a small state, a different level perhaps of a race, but as a candidate, I didn't know, did we have that option? You get to choose to not debate your opponent. How does that work, and how does that influence the outcome?
That's a great question. There's really only a couple of reasons why you would not debate. The first and the most common reason why a candidate chooses not to debate is because they feel that they are so far ahead that they don't want to give anybody, the opposing candidate, any oxygen or any airtime to kind of start making it a fight or making it a competitive race where it doesn't exist. The other is if you are concerned that you're particularly weak with certain demographics that your opponent could speak to and start making some headway and some leeway. And I think that that's exactly what is going on here. What Purdue needs to do is try to run out the clock. I always have a problem with this type of campaign, by the way, because I think if you play not to lose, you oftentimes end up losing without running an
Right.
offensive strategy, especially in a competitive race where millions of multi-millions of dollars are going to be spent, you really do run the risk of providing an argument where no argument needs to exist. And I think that Purdue, who has also incidentally been appropriately um, 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 caught with insider trading as well and trading on inside
Right.
information,
Right.
risks the same sort of downside potential. The real problem, I think, for the Republicans here would be if they are viewed as out of touch with the average Georgian, which they've clearly demonstrated that financially. If they start refusing to engage in debates and start being held to account
Right.
by media sources, I think you're going to start seeing a real sharp tightening of the race here that gives an opening to the Democratic candidates that they would not have otherwise had.
Yeah, and you make a great point about if you're running not to lose, which is different than running to win. And that does, David Perdue feels an awful lot like that to me. Especially, and you go back and look at his previous debate with Ossoff. It was not Senator Perdue's, best moment. It was not. It was not a shining moment for him at all. And so when we talk about, the worst thing that you can do as a candidate is really appear to be out of touch with the people that you're asking for their votes to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kelly Loeffler's kind of got another weakness maybe in that area as well, in that she's made some pretty rough attacks against her opponent, against Reverend Warnock in this race. She's called him radical and extreme, and a lot of other, pretty extreme language that she's used against him. And yet, just earlier this year, she stood in the Reverend's church where Martin Luther King had preached on Martin Luther King Day, and praised him and praised his church, and called him a voice. I think a voice for Georgians, and so for her now to take this really radical, we'll put her own words back on her, this radical change of tone with him now, saying that his preaching it makes him a radical. How do you square that with the voters? And how do those kinds of attacks feel to voters when they're trying to decide in between these two? And actually, as you go to talk about this again, specifically thinking about this as a runoff, where we know how turnout is everything. It seems like she's putting herself in a position where she's not going to be able to square up with the exact voters that she needs to win.
Well, look, I think that's right. And I think what the objective here is to try to push Warnock out of the mainstream, right, to make him a quote unquote extremist candidate. That attack has already begun in earnest. And let's just be very clear and candid. You've just talked about my directness. I'll offer some here. There's a clear attempt to drive this radicalism and socialism
Right.
argument against a black pastor in Georgia. There's a reason for
Right.
this, and it's because she's trying to consolidate the demographic that she needs to, specifically some of these suburban white voters, but particularly rural Georgia whites. I think this is a tall order here. She's going to be difficult. And the reason why is because she's also exposed on her own right flank with QAnon conspiracy theories. More than any Senate candidate in the history of the country, and again, there's not a long history of QAnon conspiracy theories, Georgia's got a particularly problematic situation. QAnon Marjorie, right, the woman who just won the
Right.
congressional seat in the special election that was held earlier this year, is a
Right.
QAnon open advocate, is the leader of essentially the QAnon caucus in the House, and was endorsed by and received money from Kelly Loeffler and has appeared on stage with her at campaign rallies and events. I think we're going to get a real test of what this actually means and how resonant this is when people start to gain a better understanding of how just very peculiar and radical in and of itself is this QAnon ideology and what is actually becoming a central part of the Republican coalition. This is not a small fringe group, sort of like the John Birch Society was. This is a large metastasizing element in the modern Republican Party. There are 9 open, avowed QAnon advocates in the House Republican caucus, and the president has spoken out in support of them, President Trump, so much so that it required Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, the Republican leader, to back off of his earlier criticisms of, again, the adherence of this conspiracy theory. I think this could also be playing into, Kelly Loeffler's. She's got some problems on her own right flank with the QAnon stuff. She's got to be careful with this.
Yeah, and in Maine, there's a state legislator who is an open QAnon conspiracy advocate to whom Susan Collins has donated money. The degree to which the Republican Party has just apparently decided this is okay. It's pretty shocking. Think about that, Mike. If a year ago you and I had talked about QAnon and electing people to the United States House, to the U.S. Congress who were open conspiracy theorists, we would have thought that was crazy even a year ago. And the Republican Party is all in at this point. They won't even speak up against it because they're so afraid of losing one seat. It's disappointing. Disappointing doesn't seem like a strong enough word. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Well, let's talk about that real briefly for 1 second, because a year ago this week, Jennifer, we launched the Lincoln Project. And at that time, the greatest threat was the greatest threat at that moment was the enablers in the U.S. Senate, the Republican enablers of Trump and Trumpism, as we defined it. Now we are talking legitimately.
As we were approaching the impeachment trial. Yep.
That's exactly right. Now, to your point, you're exactly right. The threat is much greater. There's a QAnon conspiracy element, right? Of course, back when we launched, we never had any idea that there would be this global pandemic, and that the politicization of basic 6th grade science would also consume the Republican Party as well, where masks have become a political weapon.
Right.
So we have seen, even in just the last year, the continued devolution and unraveling of the Republican Party from a governing philosophy of a party organized around beliefs about what government should and shouldn't be, to an amalgam of different mishmash of conspiracy theories, which I can't even make hide nor hair of. I just can't make any sense of this. So yeah, that's just in 1 year's time.
Yeah, and it's a kind of it's a warning. It's a red alert warning to how how precarious a situation we're in, and by the way, in particular, on the Republican Party, what a precarious situation the Republican Party's in. So, Mike, let's continue talking about Georgia, but move on to kind of a little different piece of it here. So, a couple of things happening in Georgia. They've certified the outcome of their election. I think that there was. I know that was, one of the areas where the president was questioning it and bringing some challenges to it. And the Secretary of State in Georgia has been clear that everything has been credible and fair and open. There have been no issues, but it's one of the areas where there's been a lot of pushback from some of these QAnon Trump supporters, the most radical members of the Republican base, coming out really pushing back hard. And we've seen some crazy stuff down there. The death threats against poll workers, a call amongst, we talked about this last week and kind of laughed about it a little bit, that, they were calling, to say, Roger Stone saying Kelly Loeffler wasn't there for Donald Trump. Don't be there for Kelly Loeffler. Like the Republican, the most radical part of the Republican base saying, don't vote for the Republican candidate in these runoff elections. I think we have a clip. The part that bothers me the most about this is the call for violence. The threats that are being made against specific individuals, their life and limb, and it has gotten so bad that Gabriel Sterling, who works in the Secretary of State's office, had to come out and address it yesterday to the press.
It has to stop. Mr. President, you have not condemned these actions or this language. Senators, you have not condemned this language or these actions. This has to stop. We need you to step up, and if you're going to take a position of leadership, show some.
If you're going to take a position of leadership, show some. He directed his comments at the president, at the senators, but this is a party-wide problem for the Republican Party. I guess I don't even know how to respond to that. When did we become, as Republicans, the party of death threats?
Well, look, there's a lot at play here, so let's talk about some of those. The first is he's exactly right. This starts and stops with the president of the United States. This kind of lunacy would come to a complete halt if Donald Trump were to stop it. Of course, we know that he's not going to. He's started this, at least the party of death threats and this extremism, the violence, and the calls for the overthrow of the government. Remember, this is a president who was talking about liberating Michigan and actively encouraging armed militia members to storm state capitals. This is really happening, folks. This is not a joke. This is really happening. And if we were watching this happen in Far East countries, Far Eastern Europe countries or in countries in Asia or Latin America, we would be watching with kind of peculiar fascination and thanking God that we don't have that going on in our country. It's happening here. It's happening today. It's happening right now. The health of our democracy is not good because, and again, this gets back to the origin story of the Lincoln Project, we recognized earlier that if we did not engage in this fight, that our complicitness would allow and encourage this to go on.
Right.
The good news is there are civil servants like this gentleman. There are Republicans like the Secretary of State in Georgia, like the Republican governor of Ohio, who are saying, stop, enough, this is done, this is over. You can't continue with this. The challenge that remains, however, is there is going to be an infrastructure after January 21st of adherents to this, of supporters of this, who are going to find what they believe to be political value in simulating this or emulating this, rather, in a way to achieve some sort of coalesced political power of whatever the Republican Party is becoming. That's the danger. So when we talk about Trumpism as a Lincoln Project, that is what we're talking about. It's not an attack between moderate conservatives and conservative conservatives or gradations of what kind of Republican you are. This is an entirely different beast. And I don't believe that it can be accommodated. I don't believe it can be ameliorated.
Right.
I don't believe it's somebody that we want to work in coalition with. This is a direct assault on our democratic institutions. It's literally trying to undermine the basic fabric of the American experiment as we've known it for 240, 250 years. And it's going to require regular vigilance to make sure that it does not continue. And unfortunately, it has metastasized, Jennifer, in the party that we have known and loved and spent our life and adult years building and growing. But I think that's why we also feel an obligation to be leaders in stamping it out and making sure that it does not grow any further than where it already has, and hopefully diminishes rather quickly.
And we should spend some time on a future show, Mike, talking about how what is the process for the Republican Party after Joe Biden is sworn in. They'll immediately have another national meeting for the RNC to elect new leadership, and we should talk a little bit about that in the future. How where does that lead the party? And they're telling me in my ear we have to go to break quickly, but I have one more thing I want you to address before I do, Mike, and that is the Republican Party is starting to have to kind of pay the piper on on some of this, maybe sooner than they expected to, embracing these conspiracy theories, allowing racism to run rampant, and in particular these theories of voter fraud that have all proven to be wrong. They have used the idea that this election was rigged to raise money, to try to fund these runoffs in Georgia. The president is using these conspiracy theories to fund his own personal purposes. And now Ronna Romney McDaniel was down in Georgia a few days ago trying to rally the troops to get focused on this runoff, to make the phone calls and knock on doors and all the things you have to do. And her base that she needs to turn out to support these candidates, all they want to talk about is the rigged election for Donald Trump. She can't get them focused on what they need to do now.
Yeah, that's the problem of crying wolf, right? Is once you undermine confidence in the elections, why are you surprised when your own supporters don't have confidence in elections? The danger, of course, here is a little bit bigger than this. And I know we're short on time, so I'll be very brief. The Republican Party, again, has lost its ideological core. It's just floating adrift. And as a result, what it does is it's just chasing whatever conspiracy theory arises to please the president of the United States. The question you're asking is what happens when the president of the United States is no longer there. What I'm going to suggest and to advise people very strongly is this, because the Lincoln Project will be, keep the receipts, folks. Do not allow us to slip back into a slumber by early spring. When Joe Biden and Kamala Harris take over and things feel we're back to normal and don't want to go back to this dark hour that we've been experiencing, we must remain vigilant. If we allow this to be a memory by April, May, June timeframe, it will get stronger. It will metastasize. It will become a central element, not just of the Republican Party, but of the American body politic. And that's the real danger, I think, that we face as a nation going forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've said this 100 times. Do not allow the Republicans to whitewash history. Don't let them rewrite this chapter in our nation's experience. That there is a tremendous amount of accountability to be had here, and we cannot allow it to your point, to get comfortable with normal reasonable leadership and suddenly act like none of this ever happened. Over 250,000 American lives lost. We cannot act like this never happened. So Mike, you're going to stay with us. Coming up next, we're going to be talking to David Lat. A lot of you may follow him on social media already. He has survived the coronavirus and has some fascinating insights to share with us. But before we get to that, we're going to share a little bit with you from the Lincoln Project.
After her COVID-19 briefing, she profits from the coming catastrophe by selling over $1 million in stock in her own personal portfolio before the market tanked. Folks, this woman is knee-deep in the swamp, and she just got there. So welcome back to Vote for America on LPTV. We're so happy that you stayed with us. And we just want to bring you your update, as we promised you that we would on each show, give you a quick update on the coronavirus and where we are as a nation. These numbers are staggering and heartbreaking, frankly. We are at an astounding 13.7 million cases that have been diagnosed in our country and over 270,000 lives lost. There were 184,174 new cases on December 1st alone. Think about that, over 184,000 new cases on one day. So many lives lost to this. It's so important that we all stay engaged in this conversation and remain as educated and as vigilant as we can be. I wear my mask when I go to the grocery store, when I go, out and about. If I'm passing people on the sidewalk, I wear my mask. It's such a little thing. It's such a little thing. Mike made a great comment a couple of minutes ago about suddenly we have all these people in the country politicizing the pandemic and trying to deny what is essentially sixth grade science. Please wear your mask. Please join the millions of us who do. It is our best avenue to try to start slowing this thing down. And our next guest understands this more than anyone. Unfortunately, he's too familiar with these numbers that we're talking about. He's an attorney. He's a legal journalist who, after contracting the coronavirus last March, spent a harrowing 17 days in the hospital. 6 of those days were on a ventilator. Please welcome David Lat. David, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jennifer.
It is great to have you. So, David, you've got quite the following on social media, I know, out there these days, and you've shared your story with folks. Essentially, back in the spring at the beginning of all this, and we saw it on your Twitter feed, you were diagnosed, you spent a significant amount of time in the hospital, like we said, several days on the ventilator. And it was a rough go for you. And we all saw that again in your tweets, including when you said when you got out of the hospital, you were so weak you needed to be using a wheelchair for a period of time. It's been many months now. So let's start just kind of a little bit, how are you doing now? Are you okay?
So thanks for asking, Jennifer. I'm doing a lot better these days. I'm very fortunate because one of the hallmarks of COVID is that many people who have it have long-term effects, the so-called long haulers. So when we think about COVID, we can't just look at the death numbers, as terrible as they are. We also have to think about the hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans who are still feeling effects even after they are technically recovered. In my case, I feel very fortunate. I had a cough and I had shortness of breath that lingered for months after I got out of the hospital. My voice was weak for months because of damage the ventilator did to my vocal cords. But I have slowly improved. And now, 8 or 9 months after that experience, I'm doing a lot better. I think I'm still, though, considered a long hauler because CAT scans show that my lungs are not back to normal. There's some scarring, so-called ground glass opacity. It looks like fuzzy white stuff on a scan where it should be black. But on the bright side, it doesn't affect my day-to-day that much. I still can't really run that much. Years ago, I ran the New York Marathon. Now I can go run about 2 miles, not quite, and then I have to stop. So I'm still feeling some effects, but I count myself very lucky because many people who had COVID are experiencing a lot worse.
And things like the lung scarring that you're talking about, is that something that the doctors anticipate will show improvement over time, or is that something that you're going to have to live with now for the rest of your life?
So that is the $1 million question. And because COVID is still a relatively young disease, we don't know a lot about the effects. So I was talking to my pulmonologist at NYU Langone, which is where I was treated. And when he's looking at the scan, he said, look, this could get better. This could be the best it gets. And we don't know.
So, David, I was thinking about you as we were preparing for this and the days you spent on the ventilator. 6 days out of your 17 days in the hospital, you're on a ventilator. So many of the stories that we've heard over these past many months, the worst stories are people going on the ventilator not knowing if they're ever going to come off, if they're ever going to be able to communicate with their loved ones again. And those, heartbreaking calls that they've had to say, I love you or goodbye or whatever they felt they needed to say before they went on the ventilator. I have to imagine that the emotional cost of this or the emotional side of this has been just as difficult, whether it's during those 17 days in the hospital or after. That has to have been just as burdensome as the physical side, the medical concerns.
It was terrifying. I had no idea whether I was going to live or die or live to see my husband and our 3-year-old son or my parents again. I was told late on a Friday night going into Saturday that I would need to be put on the ventilator. And I did not have time to make any call or anything. Sometimes people have been given time to make calls. It was the middle of the night. It was 1 or 2 or 3 a.m. And they just told me that this was necessary. They asked if I consented. Of course I did. They asked me a number of other questions, such as, did I want to be resuscitated if necessary? I said yes. I pretty much said yes to everything that involved measures to take my life, save my life, because I'm a relatively young person and I did want to live to see another day. So it was really quite terrifying when they told me I would have to go on the ventilator, because in those early days, we had news about survival rates being very low. They have since improved, and in many cases, doctors can now avoid putting patients on the ventilator. But back then, it was especially scary.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Mike. I thought you had a question. So David, yep.
I wanted to talk about, and I know this isn't necessarily in your area of expertise, David, but you've been talking about this for some time as an advocate talk about the promise of the vaccine. What does that mean to you and to our viewers? What would you suggest as we start to hear about more and more about the vaccine rolling out in the next few weeks and or months?
So I'm very hopeful about the vaccines. The initial trials seem to suggest they have a very high efficacy rate, 90, 95%, which is a home run. Many vaccines have a rate of 60%, which is considered good. So I'm optimistic. And in the new administration, we will see the vaccines get approved and rolled out. And I'm hopeful that we will begin to return to some semblance of what we had before the pandemic and before these hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. I'm planning on taking the vaccine. There's evidence suggesting that those of us who have had COVID have some level of immunity, but I'm like Jennifer. I still wear a mask. I still don't go out that much. I still really take precautions because this is a new disease, and we don't know about the exact contours of the likely immunity, but we just don't know. And there have been some reports of reinfection.
And we spoke to a doctor last week who talked about the need to continue to wear a mask after the vaccine until enough of the population has been vaccinated, and the impact that could have. So, David, you've developed kind of a following on social media. You're talking about this issue a lot. I'm curious to hear a little bit about the interactions you've had with other COVID survivors, other folks or other family members of folks who have had COVID. What are people saying about it at this stage of the game?
So when I originally went on social media to talk about my COVID experience, I was really just trying to notify people who had interacted with me that I might have unknowingly exposed them to the coronavirus. That was really my initial goal. But when I did mention publicly that I had COVID, I received such an outpouring of support from family and friends and total strangers, people who were praying of and thinking of and supporting me around the world. And I was just so supported by that and just so embraced by that. I kept on doing it. And over the course of these past few months, I've connected with a lot of other people who have had COVID and are still dealing with the long-term effects, or who had loved ones who had COVID. I've talked to some people who sadly have lost relatives to COVID. There are a lot of groups online. Survivor Corps is a great group on Facebook. Body Politic is another group. So these are groups where we can support each other, trade notes on mystery ailments we might be experiencing, share information about resources. And so social media has been a very helpful tool for helping us bond. I think social media gets a lot of criticism these days, and much of it's deserved. But at the same time, it can really be a lifeline for many people.
I guess, especially when we're dealing with things that we have so little information on. So, David, before we lose you, just really quickly, how are your husband and your son? How are they holding up and deal? I mean, I have to imagine it was incredibly frightening for them as they go through the process. How are they doing?
In some ways, the experience was harder for my husband and my parents than it was for me, in the sense that when I was on the ventilator, I was totally unconscious. I don't remember any of it. Whereas they couldn't visit me in the hospital. No visitors are allowed. And they just had to wait by the phone for updates from the nurse practitioner or the doctor about my state. So they were terrified and extremely anxious. And my husband had trouble sleeping even weeks after I got back home from the hospital. I think he just had so much residual anxiety. But they're doing a lot better now. My husband did have COVID, but fortunately for him, he had just a week of a bad flu, but he made it through, and he does not seem to have any long-term issues, knock on wood. And our son never exhibited any symptoms. We haven't had him tested for antibodies. We don't know whether technically he got it or not, but he's been his happy self. So that's been good.
And that's a great place for us to end this conversation, and I'm glad to hear that. David, this is a really important story. I'm so grateful that you were willing to come and share it with us. And I hope that you and your husband and your son and your parents have just a wonderful holiday season. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Mike. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mike, I just think it's important that we keep talking about this. You've probably heard it as often as I have. How many people in our Republican circles or in our Trump supporting friends, made comments like, oh, the day after the election, COVID will magically disappear, or, all of a sudden nobody will be worried about it anymore. Over 270,000 people have lost their lives. People are still dying from this today. I don't know how you get people to, what do you think?
I'm here in California. We're about to go into probably a full lockdown. The governor's about to make an announcement today. The numbers are spreading so dramatically. It's so out of control now. It's far, far worse than when we first went into our original shelter in place back in March. So look, the worst weeks are ahead of us. And my hope is that with a reduced level of political antagonism, we're going to be able to start addressing this as a community. I maybe sound a little bit Pollyannish about that, but I do know that every person that gets it becomes a carrier, and ultimately those numbers start to increase the loss of life and the long-term impacts, as David was just saying. We've got to get back, folks, to a sense of being able to work together as Americans. When if you can't do it in the middle of a global pandemic, I don't know when you can do it.
I think that's been our greatest, and I hope we're not being Pollyannas. Mike, you and I have talked about this before. That's been our greatest hope, our greatest ambition for Joe Biden winning this thing is his ability to, bring some unity and return some semblance of stability and normalcy so that we can do things like address the pandemic and, actually start working together to save lives. I think that would be a great thing. So, Mike, we let folks out there in our audience know that you were joining us today, and they had lots of questions for you. We have time. Let's see how many we can get through while you're with us. Let's bring up the first question, our first tweet for Mike. How do we keep the GOP from exploiting Latino votes? This is from Lawrence. I'm sorry, Lawrence, I can't pronounce your last name. How do we keep the GOP from exploiting Latino votes as a wedge against other minority votes? It appears the GOP appealed to Latino votes on the basis of legal immigration versus illegal immigration and economic chauvinism, i.e. earned their way versus welfare. How do we counter that? That's a complex and interesting question.
It's a great question, and it's a very thoughtful question. So thank you, Lauren, for sending that out along Twitter. Look, a couple of things here. There's something that we haven't talked a lot about during this election cycle. Donald Trump did not use the build the wall chanting and kind of the anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican rhetoric that he used in 2016 successfully and hurt him in 2018 in the waning days of the election. It shouldn't be much of a surprise because I think what his own polling was showing that if he would talk about economics, he would actually gain a share of the electorate that he had not before. And that appeared to be the roadmap to victory. Obviously, fell a little bit short, but it is instructive. And it is, I think, something that people need to pay attention to. And it also shows, and this may be a little bit disturbing to some folks, it also shows how loose the bonds are between Latino voters and the Democratic Party. The Latino vote is largely an anti-Republican vote. It's not a pro-Democratic vote. And that's important to understand that this vote, while leans strongly Democratic, there's a wide swath of it that is still very much up for grabs. I've been saying for decades now that the group that speaks, the party that speaks to this aspiring Latino middle class through positive, happy warrior rhetoric is likely going to dominate the national political scene for the next generation. Republicans have shown that they're not terribly disposed to do that. In fact, they've openly been antagonistic. The Democrats have struggled quite a bit on the economic messages and some of the policies that they put forward. So while I don't have a direct answer to that, I think the question is the right one. What I will say is this: a party that focuses on economics, and economics is going to do very well with the Latino vote in the coming years.
Yeah, Mike, I think you make a really important point about speaking to this aspiring class of voters. I feel the same way. I think that you're right. And I feel the same way about millennials, frankly, that we have to give them this is an aspiring group of Americans. We have to give them something to vote for, something to believe in. And if we can't speak to those people, then you lose. Yep. We have another tweet for you, another question for you, Mike. We can bring that one up. From Robert P. Dean. Actually, Mike, I think this is a great question for you. For Mr. Madrid, how to get D's more men? I'm sorry. And for Mr. Madrid, how to D's get more men to vote for their candidate? How to get the Democrats to get more men to vote for their candidates? We know that this was an issue.
It was an issue. And again, the Lincoln Project was able to move some of these voters late. The way that we did it was we focused again on economic impacts. What we see is the gender gap is largely driven by cultural issues, not entirely, and not even gender issues. A lot of that stuff is already baked in. What most people don't realize is that while there does exist a gender gap, Republicans have actually been winning the married women vote for about 40 or 50 years. Married women vote decisively different than single women. So the gender gap is in many ways kind of a misnomer. But for men, we're a little bit more stubborn, as I've talked with Jennifer about in our politics. We're not as open-minded as women. And once our political views get set, we kind of stick really hard to those views. But if you're going to move them, again, it's the same thing with the Latino vote. In fact, where Donald Trump did better with Latinos was with Latino men, not with Latino women. This male vote is largely focused on economics. At the lower level, it's about jobs, job opportunities, and some of that aspirational messaging that Jennifer and I were just talking about. For more wealthy and older folks, it tends to be more, stock market driven, wealth investments, capital gains tax issues. So economics is what drives male voting behaviors much more than it does for females. Democrats do a really good job about talking about gender and cultural issues, not so much on the economic issues. The way you get more share of the men is by talking about bread and butter economics.
Yeah. And we've always said this on election day, it's about jobs, 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 or the economy, the economy, the economy. It is very rare to have an election cycle where there's another overly influential issue the way that the pandemic was in this election cycle. Hopefully we won't ever see that again in our lifetime. Let me see. I know we have another question for you, Mike. And we'll bring that one up from P. Staley. What are the long-term goals for the Lincoln Project? That's a fun one, Mike.
Yeah, look, I think they were going to remain the same thing as we just talked about. The Lincoln Project launched about a year ago. The effort was to beat Donald Trump, where we spent 90% of our time, effort, and energy. But Trumpism will remain. And again, I think you're probably going to hear a tighter definition of what exactly we mean by that. What I'm talking about when I talk about Trumpism, I'm talking about this emergent populist threat, the movement away from a governing philosophy, the movement away from conservatism, the way from any sort of an ideological core. Let's not forget, in 2020, the Republican Party nominated a president and did not adopt a party platform. While that sounds very abstract and very mundane, the platform is extraordinarily important in terms of developing a guiding philosophy for what a political party actually stands for. By saying we don't have a platform, it basically says we are for whatever the president or the leader says we stand for. That dynamic that so many tens of millions of people are willing to just promise fealty, vote loyally, despite evidence, despite facts, despite expertise, despite common sense, is a danger to democracy specifically. And I think that the Lincoln Project, in varied ways and with our own individual talents and direction, I think all of us will be engaged in that fight in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should remind people that when the Republican Party decided not to vote on a platform, they did include in their statement their undying support for Donald Trump. I mean, they came out and said, we support Donald Trump. We support the president. So when we have to choose, am I going to vote for principle, or am I going to vote for a particular politician always, forever, no matter what? The Republican Party chose to vote for a particular party always, forever, no matter what. And that's, to your point, dangerous. Mike, it is always great to have you here. I am so pleased that you're able to make this much time for us. I know how much our audience enjoys it. Fingers crossed for whatever's going to happen for all of you in California, whether you end up in a lockdown or whatever's going to happen next. Make sure you're wearing your mask when you go out of the house, Mike. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Great. I know we're going to have him back soon. Mike Madrid, he's one of the co-founders, one of my co-founders here at the Lincoln Project. Smart guy. And of course, David Lat, to share his story with us as well of being a coronavirus survivor, one of those who's been on a ventilator and lived to tell the tale, thank goodness. So, and of course, as always, a big thank you to all of you for being with us and staying with us. And I just want to close out today. Unfortunately, we do try to focus on the positive, on what there is to be optimistic about. And there's so much to be optimistic about out there. But I learned just before we came on the air today that a very good friend of my dad's, who he has known for decades and decades, just passed away in a long-term care facility of COVID-19.
And I cannot help think about something we've discussed on the show here so many times, how many people out there, when you talk about the numbers of lives lost, will say, yes, but most of them were just old people. Most of them were in a nursing home. Most of them were in some sort of care facility, as if somehow that explains away and excuses that loss of life. Charlie was one of my dad's best friends. They've known each other since they were young men. They worked together. They've remained friends. My dad's 85 years old, and he and Charlie used to go out to lunch every Wednesday and enjoy each other's company. Charlie leaves a family behind. He leaves children. He leaves a widow. And he leaves a really good friend in my dad, who has now lost, again, another friend at a time in his life when you want to keep your friends as near and dear to you as you possibly can. That we have accepted the idea that we can dehumanize human life if it's just over a certain age is shocking and heartbreaking. And we have to do better. And what I am optimistic about, I guess, today is that on Election Day, we made a choice to do better. And that going forward, we're going to see a shift in the way that we value life in this country and the way that we talk about life, and that every life in every age and every stage is inherently valuable, is inherently important and worthy of our efforts to save and preserve and increase the quality of that life, no matter who it is, no matter how old they are. So to all of you, I hope that you do have a wonderful day. I am very happy that you were with us today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We're shifting a little bit on our shows. So this week we're going to have a show tomorrow on Thursday, again at 2:30 Eastern time. And I look forward to seeing you then on Vote for America here on LPTV.
The end is coming. The end of the noise and lies. The end of the chaos and division. The end of the hate. In its place, a new America is ready to stand tall again. Ready to restore the goodness in the heart of our nation. Ready to put people before politics. Ready to lead, to innovate, to grow, to heal. It won't always be easy. There are tough times to come. COVID to be defeated. An economy to restore. But that new day is coming. A day when words like caring, competent, and professional won't be insults. A day when compassion and character mean more than celebrity. A day when every American's rights are respected and valued. That day is coming because of your hard work, your commitment, your energy and passion. That day is coming because of your vote. Joe Biden, our president. The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Hello, this is John from San Francisco, and I have a question about the Trump challenges. It seemed to me that if there was some type of widespread fraud throughout the United States, that the Trump campaign or any campaign would look to more states than just the blue ones where Biden won. For example, why aren't they looking for votes or looking for fraud, I should say, in Ohio and North Carolina or other states that you would think that the Democrats would try to win in this election, but of course failed to win for no nefarious reasons? So that's my question, and thank you again.